Civil liberties advocates are warning that Canada's recognition of the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty threatens Canada's sovereignty and violates the Constitution.
The BC Conservatives have lost their 5th MLA since last election. This time, the MLA opted to sit in the legislature as an independent candidate.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is calling for a hard cap to Prime Minister Mark Carney's federal deficit spending as Liberals announce a, quote, substantial shortfall with no target to balance the government's unreleased budget. Hello, Canada. It's Tuesday, October 21st, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Geoff Knight.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. Canadian constitutional advocates warn that Canada's agreement to accept the World Health Organization's global pandemic treaty as binding will cede Canada's sovereignty to an unelected international group and violate the country's constitution. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms released a new report authored by journalist and researcher Nigel Hannaford, outlining how Canada's agreement to recognize the WHO's revised international health regulations as binding could violate several sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. According to Canada's public health website, Canada agreed to the WHO's international health regulations on June 1st, 2024. The WHO considers the regulations, quote, binding despite its inability to enforce them. The agreements took effect on September 19, 2025, but have been criticized by Conservative MP Leslyn Lewis and now the JCCF for being agreed upon without parliamentary dialogue. The agreements would allow the WHO Director General to declare a global health emergency and issue mandates on how Canada and member nations should respond. Once a, quote, pandemic emergency has been declared, member states are obligated to implement the WHO's emergency measures without delay. Alison Pejovic, a constitutional lawyer quoted in the report, warns that the agreement to treat the WHO's edicts as binding, quote, effectively place Canadian sovereignty on loan to an unelected international body. Pejovic notes that in the absence of, quote, proper parliamentary enactment, directives from Geneva would likely fail a constitutional challenge. She said the mandates would fail as they originate outside Canada's parliamentary system and could erode charter-protected rights such as freedom of mobility, privacy, bodily autonomy, and freedom of expression. The JCCF is calling for Canada to follow its international partners in Germany, Austria, Italy, the Czech Republic, and the United States to continue international cooperation while also refusing subordination to the WHO by reversing its recognition of the organization's authority. So this is quite a lengthy report by the JCCF, and it goes into the details of the legal and constitutional pitfalls that accepting such an agreement with an international body would pose for Canada and Canadians at large. The report also notes how following the WHO in the past has led Canada to some disastrous outcomes, and I think particularly during the pandemic. But aside from the sovereignty argument, Geoff, what sorts of things did the report say about the WHO as an institution and its effectiveness?
Well, yeah, Cosmin, the report dives deep into how blindly following WHO recommendations led Canada down some really rough paths during COVID-19. For starters, Canadian officials often sidelined their own experts and leaned hard on WHO guidance, which justified stuff like vaccine mandates for travel. The report calls out the WHO for pushing safe and effective shots that weren't fully proven, leading to a now opened vaccine injury support program for those hurt by them. On the health front, it points to a 22% spike in deaths after the vaccine rollout, with COVID deaths hitting a record 19,906 in 2022, despite widespread jabs, and a 15% rise in child deaths tied to mandates and lockdowns. Mental health took a huge hit too, with 70% of kids and teens reporting serious issues like anxiety and depression, plus surges in addiction, suicide, and opioid death that more than doubled pre-lockdown levels. Crime shot up as well. Homicides, cybercrimes, and child exploitation nearly doubled. and the economy got hammered with backlogs in surgeries and diagnostics causing preventable deaths. As for the WHO itself, the report doesn't hold back, calling it a stumbling giant that's contradictory and politically biased, especially towards China. It delayed declaring a global emergency until January 2020, echoed China's false claim of no human-to-human transmission, and took nearly 2 years to admit airborne spread. The organization pushed draconian measures like masks and lockdowns that mirrored China's playbook, all while its virus origins probe looked more like propaganda. Financial ties to China didn't help either, giving Beijing undue sway despite its small funding share back then. And overall, Hannaford argues that the WHO's advice wasn't just flawed, it was often the opposite of what science suggested. The BC Conservatives have lost their 5th MLA as Amelia Boultby, critic for Citizen Services, defected to sit as an independent on Monday, openly blaming the failed leadership of party leader John Rustad. Almost a year to the day of being elected Penticton-Summerland MLA, Boultby made her decision to leave the BC Conservatives public shortly after 9:30 a.m. on the steps of the legislature.
For being here. It is with regret that I'm here to announce that I am leaving the BC Conservative Caucus effective immediately, and I will be sitting as an independent MLA.
After announcing she would be stepping down as an independent, Boultby said she had, quote, witnessed the unraveling of John Rustad, her former party's leader. Rumors of Boultby's dissatisfaction with the party and her discord with Rustad have circulated widely since early fall. Earlier this month, on October 6th, Boultby posted a photo on her Facebook page and changed her profile photo on X to an image of her sitting alongside ousted MLA Eleanor Sturco. The otherwise minor act of changing a profile picture signaled something more significant. Just weeks earlier, on September 22nd, Sturco was seen carrying her belongings out of the legislature, en route to an impromptu press conference, after saying she too had been expelled from the BC Conservative Caucus by party leader John Rustad. According to BC Politics reporter Rob Shaw, Rustad responded to Boultby's Monday morning announcement by claiming his former MLA had, quote, mental health issues in the past, adding that he was, quote, concerned about her current well-being. So, Cosmin, what does all this mean for Conservative politics in BC, and how can the BC Conservatives hope to win another election if it continues to hemorrhage members?
Just to give a bit of a recap for people who are not from British Columbia, the BC Conservatives came essentially from nothing, from a party that was relegated to the political backwaters for several decades. They used to have a force before the 1970s, a role in government, etc. But in the meantime, they were essentially a fringe party until John Rustad himself was kicked out of the BC Liberals by the former leader Kevin Rustad, and he managed to cross over and join the fledgling BC Conservatives, which recently underwent a revamp, electing a new board, etc. And furthermore, in the 2024 provincial election, they came near to forming government. They were a few seats away from unseating BC NDP Premier David Eby. But since then, the party has struggled to unite its caucus, which is divided on several major issues, including the residential school claims, including gender identity debates, gender ideology. Not everybody sees eye to eye, and it has caused problems for leader John Rustad. And he narrowly faced a leadership blind ballot at the caucus meeting earlier this month. And since then, we're not really seeing him patch together any unity from his own caucus. And this is the 5th MLA to leave. Initially, former BC Conservative MLA Dallas Brody resigned after John Rustad cast shade on some comments she made about the residential school grave claims. And after Dallas Brody's resignation, 2 other MLAs followed behind her, including Tara Armstrong. And now with Tara Armstrong, she's created the One BC Party, which is a right-wing alternative to the BC Conservatives. But then also another MLA Jordan Keeley resigned to sit as an independent. And more recently, John Rustad has kicked out Eleanor Sturko, who was a former BC Conservative MLA. So now this is the fifth MLA to leave with Amelia Boltby. And it's still up in the air where the rest of caucus stands on John Rustad's leadership. As far as I can see from the news currently, there's no caucus meeting scheduled, and John Rustad hasn't called a caucus meeting. Ultimately, it would be up to caucus to make their own views known about John Rustad's leadership. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is demanding Prime Minister Mark Carney cap federal deficit spending at $42 billion, warning that exceeding this limit will only intensify Canada's crushing affordability crisis. The demand comes as the Liberal government signals its upcoming budget and will feature a, quote, substantial shortfall with no target for balance. While Carney has rejected the idea of austerity, he confirmed in a news conference that the deficit will be, quote, bigger than it was last year. Government House Leader Steve McKinnon said the Liberals intend to, quote, spend less and invest more, but repeatedly declined to provide figures, instead pointing to major new spending in housing, defense, and economic expansion. According to a July estimate from the C.D. Howe Institute, the deficit could rise to over $92 billion for the 2025-2026 fiscal year, with annual deficits averaging $78 billion over the next 4 years. These projections far exceed Ottawa's public forecasts. If realized, the report warns Canada's net debt could rise to 44% of GDP by 2029. Poilievre's letter, dated October 20th, frames the current situation as a continuation of a decade-long pattern of Liberal overspending and economic mismanagement. The letter said, quote, people cannot afford life in Canada after 10 years of Liberal government. You need to reverse course and join with Conservatives to restore Canada's promise that hard work is rewarded, food and homes are affordable, streets are safe, and our economy is self-reliant. He accuses Carney of breaking key promises made 7 months ago, including pledges to reduce the deficit and double housing construction. Instead, Poilievre says deficit spending has doubled and the housing agency is forecasting a 13% drop in construction over the next 3 years. At the same time, nearly $48 billion in net investment has fled the country. Geoff, we know that the Conservatives are unhappy about this, but what are financial experts saying about Carney's policies? And are there any recommendations on how the government could improve the economy while also managing the budget in a better way?
Yeah, Cosmin. Financial experts such as BMO CEO Darrell White have been pretty blunt about Carney's policies so far, saying the government's first 6 months haven't delivered enough on turning Canada into an economic superpower through natural resources. White, speaking at the Toronto Global Forum, called out the lack of progress on big projects like pipelines and removing interprovincial trade barriers, warning that without quick action, the momentum could fizzle out, especially with U.S. tariffs looming after the USMCA renewal next summer. He's worried that an international capital is eyeing Canada, but won't stick around if things stay status quo, noting that capital is not that sophisticated and flows to the easiest spots. On recommendations, White's pushing for a little less conversation and a little more action, like greenlighting infrastructure to counter tariff hits and attract investors. He slammed Canada's tax setup as uncompetitive. Absolutely not, he said, and suggested Ottawa dive into tax reform right away. Cut corporate and personal rates, let businesses write off capital assets faster, and go beyond just pausing the capital gains inclusion rate hike. Removing those interprovincial barriers could overwhelm almost any negative impact from tariffs, turning the threat into a win-win by boosting trade and growth. Overall, experts see this as a real chance for Carney to deliver on promises if he moves decisively, but the clock's ticking with the budget on the horizon.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.